Hello everyone. Today we will be talking about castling in chess. Castling is a special type of move where you get to move your king and your rook at the same time. Let's look at how to castle. To kingside castle, you move your king 2 squares toward the rook to the right, and you also move your rook 2 squares to the king to the left, and the rook ends up next to the king onto the left. This is for kingside castling. To queenside castle, we also move the king 2 squares to the rook, this time to the left because we are queenside castling, and we also move the rook to the side of the king, but this time we move it 3 squares to the right because we are queenside castling. Castling has special notation. When we castle kingside, the notation for it is a 0-0, and when we castle queenside, the notation for it is a 0-0-0. There are situations where you can't castle, however. There are 4 important rules that we must remember about castling. The first rule is that to castle, we must first clear all the pieces in the path of the king and the rook. So, in this position, we must first move the knight and the bishop out of the path of the king and the rook if we want to castle kingside. So, if we move the knight and the bishop, now we can castle kingside because there are no pieces blocking the path of the king and the rook. Likewise, if we want to castle queenside, we must clear the knight and the bishop from the path of the king and the rook. But since we are castling queenside, and the path of the queenside castle goes through the queen here on d1, we must also move the queen out of the way of the king. So now that we have moved the queen out of the way, we can castle either queenside or kingside, whichever one we prefer. The second important rule that we must remember about castling is that we aren't allowed to castle if our rook or our king has already moved, even if the king or the rook has returned to the starting squares. So in this position, if white moves his king from f2 back to e1, he can't castle because he has already moved the king. Likewise, if black moves his rook from b8 to a8, black can't castle queenside because the rook has already moved. However, black can castle kingside because the black king and the black rook on h8 haven't moved. But white can't castle on either side because his king has moved. The third important rule that we must remember about castling is that we aren't allowed to castle if our king is in check. In this position, black's queen on a5 is attacking and checking white's king on e1, so white can't castle kingside here. If we want to castle, we must first block the check, and then on the next move, we can castle kingside, as white's king is no longer in check. The final rule that we must remember is that our king can't move through check, meaning that if an opponent's piece is attacking any square on the king's path during castling, we're not allowed to castle. For example, if we're trying to castle kingside, the king moves through the f1 and g1 squares. So if an opponent's piece is attacking either one of these squares, we can't castle because we would be moving through check. Our king will be moving through check on its path. We also can't castle queenside here because the black rook on d8 is attacking the d1 square. So if we try to castle queenside, our king would once again be moving through check. Now let's look at a couple puzzles to review the rules of castling. For each example, try to figure out if white can castle kingside or queenside. If white can't, try to figure out what rule is preventing white from castling. pause and try to solve on your own before I reveal the solutions. For each puzzle, I will reveal the solution 5 seconds after I have presented the puzzle. I will reveal the solution here in 5 seconds. In this puzzle, white can castle on the king's side because there are no rules broken. White's king is not in check. White isn't moving through check. White's king and white's rook haven't moved yet, and there are no pieces blocking the king's path to castling, so white is able to castle kingside. However, white can't castle queenside because the bishop on c1 is blocking the white's king from castling. So if white wants to castle queenside, he must first move the bishop, and then on the next move, he can castle queenside. For this next puzzle, pause the video. I will reveal the solution in 5 seconds. Here, white can't castle on either side because he is currently in check. The black rook on e8 is attacking and checking the white king on e1. So, if white wants to castle, he must first block the check. So for example, he can move his knight and block the check. Now, on the next move, white can castle either kingside or queenside. In this next example, white's rook on h1 has already moved. Pause the video again and I will reveal the solution in 5 seconds. Here, white can't castle on either side. White can't castle on the king side because the rook has already moved. Remember, if either the rook or the king has already moved, white can't castle, even if they return to their starting square. White also can't castle queenside because he will be moving through check. The black bishop on h6 is attacking the square on c1. So, if white tried to castle queenside, he would be moving through check. Pause the video again and try to figure out the solution. In this puzzle, white can castle queenside but not kingside. He can't castle kingside because the queen on f1 is blocking his path for castling. So if white wanted to castle kingside, he would first have to move the queen out of the way. White can castle queenside because no rules are broken. White isn't currently in check. White isn't moving through check. White's king and rook haven't moved yet. And there are no pieces blocking white's path for castling queenside. While black's bishop on g7 is attacking the rook on a1, this doesn't affect white castling because there's no rule talking about white can't castle if his rook is under attack. So now that we have a solid understanding on the rules of castling, why is castling important in chess? There are multiple reasons. A king in the center is generally unsafe and can come under attack easily. Castling protects the king by moving the king away from the center. For this reason, it is generally a good idea to try and castle as soon as possible in the opening. A second benefit of castling is that it activates your rook. In this position, white's rook on h1 isn't very active. It's blocked, so it can't move very much, and it doesn't control many squares. By castling, white gives the rook free range. On the next move, it can move to e1 and then attack the pawn on e5. It's much more active after white castles. That's all you need to know about castling. Thanks for watching.